Okay, and I'm Sam, and this is the Illegitimate Scholar Podcast, episode 3. So far, I talked about what culture was, or what culture is, rather, and I expanded on that with comparing competing identities within one location. And in doing both of those, we talked a little bit about the environment, but I want to expand on how the environment, and specifically today, the human environment, because this is what often changes the most drastically. The human environment and how changes in the human environment affect cultural practices, and what can happen when new cultural practices that match that are better suited for the culture to progress in that new human environment and then interaction with new people, when those new cultural practices come up against old cultural practices, and what happens in somewhat of the process for that. So what we've talked about in the past two, I brought up Native Americans and Gauls and how they responded to European and Roman imperialism, colonialism, respectively. Obviously the Romans didn't invade the Plains Indians, but that would be some cool alternative history. I'm sure someone's written a book about the Romans trying to fight the Apache, and I'm pretty sure the Apache are going to win that fight, at least if they're on home territory. Okay, so I want to reiterate what culture is, again, briefly. So I talked about it being beliefs and practices and rules, rules that govern human activity of what is and is not acceptable. And these are generally meant to make the society run better, at least if working in the right way. Sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. And we'll probably talk in the future about the issues in the American criminal justice system, but I'm a far way off from doing that. So they're shared. So cultural traditions are shared. They can't really be personal. There's some quote from some anthropologists that there are as many religions in the world as there are people. Well, that's not true for culture. There are not as many cultures in the world as there are people, because cultures, by definition, need to be shared, taught, and brought down. There isn't a lot to do with personal cultural beliefs, because to have cultural beliefs, you need to have other humans that practice those, or else it's just you being an individual in every way, and nobody's an individual in every way. Everyone has some shared characteristics. Humans are communal creatures. We're not, Homo sapiens are, at least. There's something to be said, and I will probably talk about this in the future as well, of why Homo sapiens beat out Neanderthals. And the short answer is Homo sapiens are in larger groups, and there's many things about higher density groups that helps a culture. So in a lot of ways, a culture that can have a higher density, that is able to sustain a higher density, whether they're good or not, they're gonna succeed. And I'm going to speak about that when I do an episode that I actually already have planned. I've written a lot about, but I'm getting off topic, which is something I tend to do, and this is why this is the perfect thing for me. So culture changes. It adapts. It has to. Over time, some cultural traditions can be passed down for a very long time with very little change, but often that's because the relevant environment that would make it change is not changing. Generally, if a culture doesn't change over time, because there is change to the human and the physical environment over time, natural human and natural processes. These natural processes change the environment, they change the human environment, and they change the physical environment. So cultures have to change to adapt to those changes in the environment. So culture changes. It's shared beliefs and practices and rules, and there's more to it than this, but A lot about culture is how people respond to their environment to thrive and perpetuate themselves. I talked about how Islam spread out very quickly and sustained itself, and I talked about how China, which is going to get its own episode, how China is probably without fail the strongest culture in human history. I mean, it depends on how you define it, I guess. But, China, if you say like Indo-European, because, Indo-European is like a more broad culture even than you would call Chinese. But like nationality level type culture, China is the most, it's the best culture that, best in the sense that, like I talked about before, it perpetuates itself. So today I want to talk about a couple specific examples of times when there was a change in the human environment specifically, and this led to a massive change in the culture. And sometimes, like I talked about before, this can be very, very destructive. So there's a huge chance when a culture, when there's a human environment change, that the ingrained culture, the ingrained power structure, which is related to culture, they don't want to give up their power. They really don't. They will do everything they can to give up their power. And sometimes a process of cultural breakdown will start, but it won't complete itself in a complete change of the culture away from the old power structure. It'll just kind of reform itself. We've seen that a lot of different times in history. Examples off the top of my head would be like, the Magna Carta in England, it reforms the monarchy, which makes it a lot more acceptable because the nobility, these classes that had gained power, they had more power. Peasant rebellions sometimes get things done. Sometimes they would completely overthrow a monarch. Most of the time, they would get just killed. But sometimes they would get some things passed. There have been the American culture very early on, it has to reform itself very quickly from the Articles of Confederation, this early weak form of government that the people with the power, the statesmen, English aristocrats descended mostly, were deciding how to rule the country, and the Articles of Confederation weren't working. And there was a chance of the United States, this little experiment at the time, being taken back over. So they had to change the culture, and they went to the Constitution. And then the Civil War, the American Civil War, was a reckoning in the cultural sphere as well. And there were many changes that came during and after that in order to sustain the American culture and the ingrained power structure that was being created. So often what will happen is the situation natively changes to the point where, and when I say natively, I mean like the situation in wherever the culture is, it gets so bad for whatever reason. There's these new things that make the old system not make any sense. It's not serving the people. New classes of people have gained power, and they want to exercise that power. Example, French Revolution in the late 1700s, around the 1790s. A lot of peasants had worked their way up. There are yeomen, some of them own property. There are rich merchants, and they're traditionally outside of the classes of the nobility and the clergy, which are the privileged classes, and these people don't really pay taxes, even though they have most of the wealth. So the power earlier, this system worked because the peasant class, which is the majority of the population, this free man's class, they don't have any power, so they can't really do anything. And the system wasn't as oppressive earlier on in time. So the privileges, they grow over time. The ingrained power gets worse and worse and worse, and the corruption grows. I wonder what my American listeners, which is most of you, are hearing when I say that, because it probably draws a lot of similarities to what's happening today with growing corruption and increased power within a certain group of people. But in the French Revolution in the 1790s, it's grown to the point where the institutions are so oppressive, and this third estate, these free class of people who are not clergy and not nobility, they've gotten powerful enough. They have enough sway in the form of, like, this is early capitalism type time. So there's trade is starting more. There's more currency trading. So these people have power, and it gets to the point where they no longer accept the situation that they're in, and the culture needs to shift. And there is an attempt by the king at the time to reform, but the ingrained power in the nobility and the clergy, they don't want to do that, or a lot of them don't. Some of them do. Some of them are reformists. It's a big mess. I'm sure all of you know a little bit about it because it's taught a lot in North American history classes, even. So what happens eventually is they kill the king, and they kill a bunch of nobles, and they start killing a bunch of people, and they really reform the society. And there's a huge shakeup of the old system, and they have basically a new system, and then another new system, and another new system, and another new system. And there's like 45 French republics or whatever. It's not that many, but it's a lot. But the point is that the system changed over time, and the ingrained power structure was incapable of reforming itself to meet the changing situation. So unfortunately, the only way to shake it up, if you can't reform it, the only way to get a new system which is going to work and prosper is by revolution. And revolution does not necessarily have to be violent. Revolutions can also be things like the industrial or the agricultural revolution, or the green, in parentheses, in quotes, green revolution of the 60s, which is really industrial agriculture, which was horrible. But these revolutions, they're destructive in the sense that they're changing the old system. There are bloodless revolutions as well, like the revolution of, I think it's called the Glorious Revolution or whatever, with William of Orange, where there are changes in the political system that's bloodless. So a revolution is just a big destruction of the old system, and a new system is put in place. And this can be political, it can be technology, it can be many, many different things. So this revolution happens, it creates a new system. That's what had to happen. And we're going to talk about some other times when this happened as well, when the human environment changed. So there's a book. There's a small, it's not very well-known book called Cassowary's Revenge, which is an ethnography, as in it is a book about a culture, this culture being one in Papua New Guinea. So on New Guinea, there's a village, and I think it's a relatively large village. It's been a while since I read this book, but there's a few thousand people that live in this village, I think, at the time. And there's an anthropologist, the guy who wrote the book, Daniel Tuvin. I hope that's right. And he visits this village like 17 years prior, and he goes there and he studies this cult. They have this is patriarchal cult that exists and is the power structure of this village, and it's based on this origin story about a cassowary, which is a flightless bird that lives in this area. It's a dangerous bird, and it's the subject of a lot of origin stories in this particular area. So the origin story is long, and I recommend the book, but it comes down to women are bad. It's a patriarchal cult that runs this society, and without going into too much detail, this cult sometimes kills women, sometimes children. Reading about it is pretty horrible. I'm sure we have a limited understanding about what is actually happening. So I don't want to pass judgment on it, but it was a pretty horrible thing that was the power structure from a Western perspective. It was a pretty horrible thing that was going on in this place. And this was when he originally goes there, the cult is in full swing. They're doing these rituals. They have temples and things. And really what's happening is the older men in the village are running this cult. They're perpetuating it. Older men, as they get older, they get far and farther into the cult. and they get more power, and as they get older, and then they introduce new members, lower members, and each stage they go up, they get deeper and deeper into this cult. So it perpetuates itself, and then eventually the oldest men retire, and they somewhat seemed like they used this as an excuse to play dress up and get drunk and run around in costumes, which sounds like a lot of fun. I mean, I'm not down with killing people, but it would be great to get away from your wives and kids for a weekend and run around and drugs. Maybe I don't know if hallucinogens were involved, but they're going out there, they're doing dude shit. Okay, guys like to. In the West, we like to go camping. We don't like to go into the woods and kill people, but it's kind of the same idea, right? I think that in a certain way, these guys that were, the good old boys of Papua New Guinea, they have this power. They want their power. They do it through a very strange to us way that matches with the society that they live in. The women don't know that it's the men doing it. They have elaborate things about this. But the art anthropologist from England, Australia, America, somewhere, and he doesn't go back for 17 years, and eventually he goes back, and he goes back to a completely different place because the cult still kind of exists, but the village has been opened up to the modern world. The village now there's a church there, there's missionaries, there's multiple Western people, there's roads, there's certain newer technologies. And the people are much more integrated into the world. And what he observed while he was there is that, and my memory is a little bit fuzzy on this, but he observed new influence from the church. And in this particular case, the church that was in there was offering a much more, I mean, it's hard to get much worse than what they were doing because they were literally killing women, but the church was a liberating force for the women in this area. So the church is very appealing to a lot of the people there, and they're being influenced by the culture, by Western culture, including ideas of more equality for women. And eventually what this leads to is a few of the women in the church, or a few of the women in the village, they run into the church, and in full view of everybody, they expose this cult that people believe, or they're supposed to believe, that is run by demons and spirits and things like that are killing people. And they run in and they expose the men, and they're like, oh no, the spirits aren't real. The men are doing it. We have proof. They have some sort of proof. And they expose this cult, and it basically, the cult at that point dies. It was kind of dwindling at that point, but then it's dead because the secret is gone. The magic is gone. If somebody had done that 20 years prior, if some women had run into a local area and they had tried to expose this cult, even if they knew that it was really the men doing it, then they would probably be killed for that. I mean, if what the anthropologist wrote was true, that these men are killing some of the women, I assume that exposing the cult would be a capital offense, because it would be a threat to their power structure, and it would then, if these women threaten the cult and were then killed and nobody can do anything about that, then it kind of solidifies the power of the cult even more. And I think that I assume there were plenty of women, plenty of other people who knew what was going on, but they, what are they going to do? They can't. What are they going to do about it? But with the influence of modern technology, more modern ways of thinking, their experience, they're exposed to these things. It inevitably changed the culture eventually after enough years of exposure. Okay, so it was this new environment, this new human environment, and there's a new power structure that is attempting to move in, a new religious structure in this case, the church, and exposure to Western technology, and it changes the culture and it destroys this ancient cult that in the new environment just no longer makes any sense. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is the Native American church. And a Native American church could just be a church that is, run by Native Americans. There's Korean churches in a lot of places. There's plenty of other, there's churches that are for a bunch of different ethnicities. But the Native American church, like proper name Native American church, is a church that is a part of something called Pan-Indianism or Pan-Native Americanism. And what pan means, I think pan means across, so or something. It means all. So Pan-Native American ideas are ideas that are for all Native Americans, and there are other movements like this that existed, especially around the late 1800s, early 1900s. This was a very anti-colonial idea in the past in a lot of places. There was Pan-Latin American movements. Simón Bolívar was a part of one of these. Trying to make a like not split up into a bunch of different countries, have a broadly Latin American state for the same reasons that the founding fathers. I think I spoke about this in one of the last 2 episodes. How the founding fathers wanted to keep the country together, keep these colonies together so that they weren't fighting each other, so that they're not wasting energy on fighting each other. This is a problem that I've talked about before. And, with that more powerful identity, like I talked about with competing identities, you need an identity that can sustain this larger area. So there's other movements. There's Pan-Asian movements. There's Pan-African movements. There's lots of these different movements that people are trying to do. And I mean, really, they don't exist that much anymore. But in the past, they were these pretty serious movements that were attempting to respond to this massive change of decolonization. And these were people from nations that were colonized that recognized the need for political institutions, for really good political institutions, which is something I'm going to get to on this podcast as well. And a peaceful area, and how much money and lives and energy and everything is wasted on warfare, and how much better off many people could be if they are able to work together. But to make it plausible to work together, there are certain factors that have to be in place. So the Native American church, it's an example of Pan-Indianism, Pan-Native Americanism. And there's also a Pan-Indigenous movement today across the world, and this includes communities from Eastern Siberia, from countries like Peru, from Native American tribes in the United States and Canada, New Zealand, anywhere where there's indigenous people, which is most places unless they were either entirely wiped out or they just became the structure of the country. There is now, because of the internet, a worldwide structure for indigenous people to communicate and share their like whatever traditional knowledge they have, as well as politically work together, because indigenous people often contemporarily face a lot of the same problems in different places. So, United States, Canada, Australia, indigenous people in those countries historically have faced similar issues, and it allows people to work together, which is great. So the Native American church, actually getting to that now. This is a church that forms in Oklahoma in the late 1890s, which I think was after it became Oklahoma, but it might have been Indian Territory at the time. But for those of you who don't know, there was this thing called Indian removal that brought Native Americans from a bunch of different parts of the United States into Oklahoma, which is it's not good land. It was like land that the settlers didn't want, essentially. And it was forced removal. There were death marches, of a lot of Native Americans that were forced to go to these places. Many of them accepted. Some other tribes continued to fight instead of face removal, especially after it became obvious that the people there were not being taken care of effectively. So these were reservations where they were brought to and facing high death rates, not enough food, not protection, and where they cannot practice. Most of them were not able to practice their cultural practices because there was a new environment that doesn't allow for their ways of life, and they're told to farm this shit dirt land. So, and they're all brought together from different parts of the country because in Oklahoma, it was a mix of Native Americans from all over the country. I think largely from the South and from the Great Plains, if I'm remembering correctly. A lot of Native Americans from Florida and other places, and they're all brought into Oklahoma, and it allows they're brought together with the technology of the time, and unfortunately through this forced removal. But often there are new cultures that form out of forced assimilation, when people are forced to be brought together. There's many rich cultures that came out of slave communities from enslaved peoples that were brought from Africa to the southern United States, as well as to the Caribbean and to South America. Brazil, I think, is the place where the vast majority, or the largest percentage of groups, and things come out of this. Things come out of this mix of culture and this forced melting pot. Not to say that it's a good thing. Obviously, everything we're talking about here is just horrible. It's all terrible. Women are getting murdered, and then the church comes in and it destroys the traditional culture. And it's great that women aren't getting murdered, but it's not like this is a great situation for them overall, even at the time. Although I assume that it's at least marginally better for the women. Okay, so the Native American Church in Oklahoma, it forms, it's for all Native Americans is what it eventually comes down to, because often what'll happen is in traditional history education, Native Americans will be lumped in together as one group, and that's not remotely true. There was a lot more diversity amongst Native Americans in North America than there was between European groups in Europe at the same time. And that's not to say that there was no culture amongst the Europeans, but it is to say that there was diversity in Europe, but they had shared technology in Europe much more than they had in native North America. So people were living very different lives in, for example, the Northeast of the United States, where they're living in wigwams in forested areas, versus Plains Native American tribes that are living on the plains and living in teepees, to vast, large communities that are living in the Mississippi Valley in cities. There's no cities in the Northeast. There are cities in the Mississippi River Valley and in some parts of the Southwest, but there aren't in certain areas of the Northeast. So what this does is, because of this new technology, because of this forced removal, they being Native Americans, are in Oklahoma, and they're mixing together, and they're talking to each other, and this Native American church comes out of this need to have a religion that is for all Native Americans to be a uniting force, which is a uniting factor between Native Americans, many of whom have traditional issues. And I think it became very obvious to a number of very smart, very wise people that in order to save any of their ways of life, they have to not only adapt, but they have to work together and be stronger, because the United States as a political entity is united mostly. I mean, the Civil War obviously was a test of that, but there are many Native American groups that come out after that are in coalitions, that are in alliances at this time, because it becomes a necessity. Okay, so the Native American Church addresses this need for something that is for all Native Americans. And what's interesting is it includes parts of Christianity. It includes parts of traditional religions of a lot of Plains Indians, but it uses peyote which comes from farther south. And I don't think everybody in this uses peyote, but peyote is it has the compound mescaline in it, and it has hallucinogenic properties, and they use it as part of their religious practices, and these religious practices are shared now amongst a bunch of different Native American tribes, nations, and groups. So this addresses that need, and it comes out, and it's only able to come out of this technology. You wouldn't have needed in, pre-Columbian Native America, they don't have the technology to, like, there's no railroads. I mean, there's no railroads in Europe at the time either, but they don't have ocean-going ships to our knowledge. They're not spread out. There are massive trade routes between, like, Mississippi, and there's trade routes between, like, North Carolina and, like, Canada. Like, there are extensive trade routes that go a lot of different places, but they're not as, there's no need for people in what's now Maine to be using the same religion as the people in now Montana. It's just not there. But now there is that need. And what eventually happens is a lot of Native American groups banding together are able to do things in the early 20th century to argue for things like them being allowed to use peyote, which they call their traditional medicine, even though for a lot of Native Americans, the history of using that medicine doesn't go back more than one or two generations. Not that I think that they shouldn't be allowed to use it, but they successfully lobby the American government to give that to them. And then there is a history of, there's a lot of issues with the treatment of Native Americans in the United States, but there is also a consistent history of a lot of political victories that come for Native Americans out of being a united force that has a lot of different people involved in it. It's, there's not 3,500 different tribes trying to each individually argue their case, but they can instead band together and unite their strength to lobby the government and to argue for what they need as a people, because a lot of them have shared issues that are common to a lot of different Native American tribes. Okay, so cargo cults. I want to talk about cargo cults. So this is something that people have probably heard about, and I want to start talking about that by a quote that some of you have also probably heard by a science fiction writer by the name of Arthur Clarke. And he coined the phrase, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And basically what this quote means is that if there is a technology that is super advanced for where we can't understand it, we can't tell the difference between magic. And that's anybody. That could be us too. If an alien spaceship that can travel interdimensionally, if that's even possible, were to pop down in my front yard right now, I wouldn't know what the heck I was looking at. It might as well be Merlin coming down with his freaking staff and coming to bring the King Arthur of New England out of a stone. He's pulling a Dunkin' Donuts cup out of a stone and crowning himself the King of Boston. Okay, sorry. Cargo cults have happened in multiple places, and what they are is this could happen in multiple different times in history. But what happened in a lot of places, very common, more common than you would ever think, is in World War II. There are a lot of remote islands in the Pacific where the British, Americans, Australians, they're fighting the Japanese. So they need airstrips on random islands. And a lot of these places are uncontacted or only semi-contacted indigenous tribes that are just living with traditional methods in these places. And because of that, they have very limited technology. So they don't have the concept of what an airplane is, what jeeps are, canned food. These things are very foreign to them. They've had no prior experience with this. So I want to make very clear that these people are not stupid. These are modern Homo sapiens. They have the same brain intellect, or similar brain intellect to any other Japanese person, European person, African person. It's the same thing. They're Homo sapiens, same species. but their understanding of the world was based on very different things. So the only reason we understand and accept what an airplane is because we grow up with them, and people learn about physics in school, and they learn about lift, and I remember even being in elementary school, we're learning about paper airplanes and how paper airplanes apply to an airplane. Okay, these people don't have airplanes; they don't have fucking paper. So how the hell are they going to know about this stuff? It doesn't matter to them. They're in the jungle living in like huts, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're probably happier than all of us. But regardless, they're not stupid. They just don't have this constructivist, this buildup of knowledge that goes one over the other that would build you up to understand an airplane. I mean, an airplane's a crazy thing. It's a metal box that seems like it's just floating through space. If floating through the air, it doesn't make any sense at all. If I saw that, like, think about what you would think if you saw that and you just didn't have the understanding of what an airplane was or how it worked, or even what gasoline was, which is refined through a process that I don't understand personally, but I vaguely understand that it comes from like crushed up dinosaurs, which is fucking ridiculous. So these people are smart people, smart as you and me, so they're probably dumb, but regardless, we're all dumb. So this happens mostly after World War II. During World War II, people come in with planes. They share as much information as they can. They try to explain where they're from to people. They tell people we're from America. We're from England. One of them, still today, they worshipped Prince Philip. They had a picture of him, and he'd never even been there. The British soldiers just told him about it. And Prince Philip eventually goes and visits them, which is pretty freaking cool. But these are a bunch of different islands, and what ends up happening is cults. They call the stuff that they bring, the goods that they're bringing, the food, all the stuff they're bringing on airplanes, which they don't see a factory, but they see a can. So how are they going to understand it? You can't explain a factory to somebody that hasn't even ever seen a 3-story building. So the cargo cults, cargo being all of the goods that are coming in that these people are eating, that they think is amazing, because frankly it is, cults form around them where people are like, okay, so we saw what these guys did, and these were soldiers and Marines. We saw what they did, so we're going to imitate those rituals. It was like their understanding of the world was very limited, based on like what was actually happening. So it would be ridiculous to expect them to understand what all is going on in America to produce these goods that are coming to them. But they do know that they saw troops marching before a plane came in to deliver goods. So they're like, okay, so we're going to copy the rituals that they did, and then we're going to get our cargo. We're going to get more of that cargo. So what happens is a lot of these places happen. They happen differently in different places because people have different ideas. But a lot of them die out after a few decades, because what they're doing, these rituals, they don't work anymore. Or like, there's different things in different places, but like the rituals don't work. They try marching, and nothing happens. Nothing happens. No more cargo is brought. So they're like, okay, we give up. But in a few places they exist even until today. And there's one about John Frum, which has a few different good short documentaries done about it, which is, oh crap. It's a small island. But in this island, they have rituals where they dress up like American soldiers. They write USA on their chests. They have like bamboo made to look like rifles, and they do marching and drill that is pretty good for like American military. It's clear that they're trying to reconstruct it, but they're doing it like pretty much how actual American troops would do drill. And there's videos of this online. So these cargo cults are in response to this very weird thing, which is this massive change in human culture in their human environment, because people come out of nowhere. They come out of the sky, and all these men pour out of this metal tube, and they don't even have refined metals, and they bring all this stuff, and this was a huge change to this culture. They're like, what the fuck's going on? And then these guys all leave, and they don't really come back. And in certain places, people do come back, and they do bring some stuff. Large groups of soldiers never come back, I think, to any of these places, besides some that are made permanent. And in that case, I think the cargo cult just goes away because it becomes normalized to them. And they come and they build infrastructure, and this stuff makes more sense over time. But in this John Frum cult, which still goes on today, in some of the documentaries, there's arguments between the older men and the younger men, because some of the younger men, they don't believe in it, and some of the older men, they're like, no, like, this is our custom, this is our belief, like, this is history, this is like what we do. It's ingrained in them that this is what they're supposed to do. And I respect custom a lot more than most people. I think I have great respect for tradition. But I think the initial thinking that anyone would have about this is that, well, obviously it's not going to work. But when you see the video of these people, they're all wearing American clothes. They're wearing not American clothes, made in like Vietnam or Taiwan or wherever. But they're wearing modern Western clothes. They're doing most of them, when they're doing their rituals, are in blue jeans, and they're not wearing shirts, and they have USA written on their chests. But the leaders have actual American military uniforms, and a few of the guys that do a flag changing ceremony where they have an actual both American flag and a Marine Corps flag, United States Marine Corps flag, excuse me, those guys are wearing actual Marine Corps uniforms. So clearly there is more of an understanding with these people about what their cargo cult is trying to accomplish. And so they have more of an understanding than just the troops came and then they left. These people clearly have had more interaction with Americans. And the guy who is saying, like, we have to stick with tradition, we have to stick with custom, America will help, he knows what America is. Like, he is aware that it's a thing. He wouldn't recognize Ohio. I assume he's seen some videos at this point. But, like, it seems almost like he is trying to do this in a sense to get attention from people in America so that they'll help his village. And he's convinced that it'll happen. And honestly, I think he might be right. Like I said, these people are not stupid. They're just basing their understanding on what they know. And this cargo cult, where the cargo cult is initially, it seems at first glance, a very silly thing, where people would be doing a ritual in order to summon an airplane. And we know an airplane doesn't work like that. That's not going to summon an airplane. But in their limited understanding, I say limited, but it's not like it's limited. It's just different. They have a different understanding of the world that wasn't able to understand why these planes were coming in. So I wonder what would happen. Like, I think about how I would respond if something like in other dimensional craft came into my front yard. I mean, I wouldn't understand it either. It would be indistinguishable to me from magic. But over time, most of these cargo cults go away, and this one stays. And I think it stays because it becomes something different, where this guy has a better understanding of America. He has a better understanding about what the West is because of there being more interaction between our cultures, because there are Americans going there, and there's American products being brought there. And those things also, they don't have a direct understanding of how they're being made. But there are goods from America coming in. There is cargo from America coming in. So it's not like the cult's not working. I mean, I guess the cult, the marching is not a ceremony that's like bringing the Americans in, but in another very real way, having them do that ritual is getting the attention of Americans, and they are bringing some cargo in. So in another way, it is very real what this cargo cult brings. And because it brings real results, at least that was my impression, and it has, because there's small results and there's the possibility of a bigger payout in the future, which, again, like I said, I think is possible, then this cult is able to survive when other ones weren't. So this brings me to think about how cultures they just have to be able to sustain at the very least, and hopefully progress, and that will make them grow over time. But a culture can, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense to people, and a lot of the rules and things don't, if it works for a lot of people and it works for the right people, it will continue to be persistent. It'll continue to exist. I think I've been a little bit more all over the place than normal today. Somebody let me know if they think I have been or not. I'm trying to work on this. But, okay, so I'm talking about this cargo cult, and specifically this John Frum one. And it's interesting. It's really, really interesting. But what it really makes me think about, what all of these different things make me think about, the Native American church and the breakdown in Papua New Guinea of the patriarchal cult, they all make me think about how this applies to Western and American culture. And when I look at American culture over the past my life, even within my own lifetime, what I see is a culture, or a culture that is responding very rapidly to very rapid changes in technology. If a culture is responding to environmental change, which includes technological change, because the way that technology changes our environment, because it changes the way that we interact with things. When the technology changes that quickly, human culture is just not able to keep up. It's just, we're used to things changing much more slowly. So this is why culture changing so quickly when there's an introduction of something crazy like Europeans land on your formerly uncontacted island. It's why crazy stuff like this happens, and why there's huge social upheaval, is because the technology is changing too quickly for almost any political structure, social structure to survive that. It's very hard for those systems to mold themselves to what's the word? They respond in, gosh, they can't not reproduce, refrain. What's the word? They reform. That's the word. Yeah, they can't reform themselves. They don't have time because things change too quickly, and they just seem too ridiculous. And the metaphorical women run into the church and they say that the men have been running around the woods naked, killing people and getting drunk. And so this technological change, I think, can be related to a breakdown in social and cultural institutions. And in the West, I think that's manifested itself in a massive loss in religiosity. In all Western countries, there has been, over time, and especially in younger people, and increasingly so in younger people, a rejection of religion. We're at all-time highs for people identifying as irreligious. And I'm going to talk more about religion in the future, but there are a lot of people now that are identifying as having no religion. And frankly, I don't believe them. I think that they just don't think that they have a religion, which I think is a different thing than actually not having a religion. And I don't necessarily view not having a religion really as that possible. I guess in the Western traditional sense, yes, you might not have a religion. But to me, what I think happens is that people take that part of their brain, because there's religion in every human culture, they take that part of their brain that's supposed to deal with religion and they apply those to other things. And so they have religious attitudes with certain things. And I'm going to talk about what specifically in a second. But So when I see massive technological change in social institutions unable to grip with that quick social change, what I think of is what's going to replace it, and what in our environment and what changes are going to happen in our beliefs based on the changes in technology that we have. And what it comes down to for me is and I'm going to expand on this. I have to. There's so much to say on this. But what is our culture lead to if religions can't reform and people have to create new religiously minded belief systems based on new technology? And I think they lead to a lot of things that are based on an increasing pervasiveness of capitalism and commodification of absolutely everything, making products after everything. And so in a certain level, money is our God. And there are religious attributes to our relationship with money and currency and capitalism, because there are certain things about it that only make sense and they only exist because we all just kind of agree that they do. And for example, just like this cult could be destroyed by this new church coming in and people realizing how dumb the cult is based on new information that they have. What if, for example, aliens came down with advanced technology? They could produce whatever they wanted, and they basically gave everybody 3D printers, everybody in the world 3D printers for free, and they could print whatever they wanted. So you could print a Lamborghini, and then you print gasoline and you pour it in the Lamborghini, and if it breaks, you have a destructor thing that gets rid of it, and you just get a new one. What's that going to do to the economy? Like, it's going to destroy it because it's not going to run anymore. But I guess it wouldn't matter because people's needs would be met by food. They'd be, if you can print food, you have all your needs met. You can print yourself shelter and things to sleep on. Then there's really no problems. But it would be a complete breakdown of any social structure that's held together. Like, nobody's going to have authority anymore if there's no fighting over any resources at all. No one's going to listen to their boss if they can print a goddamn Lamborghini in their front yard. Or if they can just, they could go out to the desert and just claim some land that no one's living on, and they could set up whatever they want there because they can print whatever they want. But regardless, other things. I think celebrity worship is another thing that I've heard get brought up sometimes. Human beings that are celebrities, like in the past, only somebody like an emperor would be that untouchable. And I'm thinking an emperor of China, not like an emperor of France. The guy's barely a king, okay? But like an emperor of China, that's like a revered figure, or the Great Khan. They're like super, super revered, super untouchable to human beings, regular human beings. Those are the only people that are going to have millions of people that are like pining over them. But now, Ryan Reynolds got like 40 million freaking Instagram followers. And so Ryan Reynolds, who's one of many different celebrities, hundreds, probably dozens at least, of celebrities that have tens of millions of followers that follow them, that's not normal. Like, there's no other technological situation in human history when a large number of people had that, especially when their lives are as public as they are. Like with the Great Khan or a Chinese emperor, they might never interact with anybody but the nobility. They're barely going to speak. They're going to be completely detached from society. Whereas, now celebrities are detached from society, but they are in the public image. They're detached in the sense of how they live, but people know what they're doing. It's just an idea. I'm going to talk more about it later. Yeah, and I also, what I see, and this is going to bother some people, but a religious devotion to science. Which is anti-science. So in my opinion, because science breeds on disagreement. And anyone that says the science is settled, I mean, if the science is settled, then what's the point of having science? If you can't question something, the point is to question everything, I think. But I digress. There is a religious devotion to science, which means that like certain scientific things are taken as scripture, and denying them is considered offensive because they're like scripture to people. They're basically might as well be the pages from the Bible, and if you deny them, you're denying their religious beliefs. And if you want to question certain things, then you're a heretic, essentially. Okay, so I think I've talked enough. I don't have anything else to say now, and I hope this wasn't too all over the place. I'd love to hear any feedback. I dropped my email in the description. So yeah, please send me an email if you have any thoughts, if you have anything you want me to talk about, because I'd love any suggestions of the 12 people that listen to this podcast. All right, thanks a lot. Have a good rest of your day.